Bernard Furlong is from Ferns in County Wexford, and he has been attending the facility in Enniscorthy for people with intellectual disabilities for the past 30 years. In recent years, his salary of €40 per week has been cut to zero, and now he's working for nothing. The facility receives over €1 million in taxpayers' money and also has an extensive fundraising campaign throughout the year. Yet, they pay their staff nothing. Bernard's brother John will continue the story.
Well, my brother started in the bookshop in Enniscorthy here in Kilcannon, and he went in as a trainee when he was 18 years of age. And he was told that he would be trained in different things, and my mother and father were very happy because there was nowhere else to go at the time. And he worked all through the years, and they more or less looked after him and looked after his affairs. But my mother, when she got older, she left more of that to me. So I was looking after his affairs and trying to make plans for the future as people are worried. And you'll often find that old people, in the middle of the night, when they're lying there in their bed awake, they often say, what's going to happen to John or Joe or Bernard or someone that I have with a disability, and when I'm gone, who's going to look after him? Well, I honestly thought, and the family thought, that he would be cared for. I mean, mother and father honestly thought that he would definitely be cared for in the Enniscorthy workshop. And back in those days, you were told, this is going to be a home from home, and we'll always stand by him if he ever needs anything. And that was one of the reasons why they said they couldn't afford to pay him any kind of decent wages or anything like that. So suddenly, my mother was, in a few years, my mother ended up in a nursing home. I had applied for planning permission in Bernard's name for a building here. You can see the building went on. And I was told by the county council that there was a grant available. And it was to keep all the receipts, as there was no money in that year. So when I had finished, I went looking for my grant and was told that there's no records of any planning permission. There was no records ran in Wexford County Council, and he wouldn't be entitled to a grant as he wasn't the owner of the house. Now, how can you put a house into the name of someone with a mental disability? So this started me, and I went and approached in a Enniscorthy workshop. And when I went in, I think it was November, December in 12, the dates are there on it, and I tried to get some help and some assistance because of the budget of that year, where he had been cut about €50 a week because of household charges, cut in his rent allowance, cut in his ESB allowance, his heating allowance, all the allowances were cut. And what they done with me was they arranged a couple of meetings. You can see the meetings there with different people from the HSE, and they arranged those meetings. And while those meetings were going on, and on the second meeting, I had big issues, and they were starting to discover the situation as it was. And suddenly then I was informed by one of the people that were at that meeting that there was a cut already going to take place, that the decision had already been taken to cut this €40 a week allowance. And this is what I withdrew all contact with him and told him that I would take this further. I contacted the board of directors, 3 or 4 members of the board of directors. They told me they knew nothing about the cuts, but they would inquire on it. And suddenly then the next response I was getting off them was, no comment, Trevor's dealing with that. No comment, Trevor's dealing with that. I then approached RT's Primetime and asked them would they like to do a feature or a programme on a modern day Magdalen laundry, because that's what this was turning out to be. RT Primetime came down, they filmed here, and they tried to get a response from CWCW in Enniscorthy, and they also tried to get responses from other directors in the rehab and places like that about what was going on, and they were highlighting this workshops and the fact that people had no rights. People with disability have no right whatsoever. They have no right to appeal anything, and it's a case of this is what we're giving you, cope with your lot. When the RT Primetime people came down here, and I didn't know, they didn't tell me how bad things were in Ireland and the extent of this. I was absolutely shocked to look at the programme, where you can look at the programme now as well, and you will see that people with disability have got no rights whatsoever.
but many thousands spent their working lives in these factory settings, often working on commercial contracts and receiving just a token allowance for their work. Now there are calls to compensate them. Mark Coughlin of the RTE Investigations Unit has this special report.
They were almost like ghost workers in the system.
You're only working there for pittance.
Thousands of people with intellectual and physical disabilities spent decades in Ireland's sheltered workshops. In the early years, they provided one of the few outlets for people with disabilities. However, many workshops also had commercial contracts, supplying products to some of Ireland's leading businesses. Yet, for the most part, people in these workshops received only a tiny allowance for their work, had no employment rights, and existed in a legal limbo.
I was appalled by it. I was astonished that it would be assumed that people would go in and work anywhere and with no real rights.
For 3 decades, the state promised reform of the workshops, but failed to deliver.
There were no employment inspections. There were no wage receipts. This is an unregulated sphere. It must be regulated now.
We genuinely thought that this was the best thing for people. I have never experienced somebody being exploited in a workshop.
Now the head of the Labour Relations Commission, Kieran Mulvey, says that many of the people who passed through sheltered workshops may be due compensation for their work.
These were the most vulnerable people in employment at the time, and it's not beyond the bounds of ingenuity for us to address it now. Justice delayed is justice denied.
One thing that may not be immediately obvious about these workshops is the courage of the organisers to let handicapped children work dangerous machines.
The sheltered workshops would have been very prominent in the 60s and 70s, but in a sense they go back much further than that. They go back to the 19th century, to the industrial schools, the asylums, the workhouse. They all had their own workshops, and the view was that the poor should pay their way.
From their early beginnings in the 1950s, sheltered workshops were run mainly by non-profit organisations to provide training and work for people with physical and intellectual disabilities. In the absence of many other supports for people with disabilities, workshops were soon rolled out across the state. Funding came from government and from commercial contracts, which the charities actively sought out.
Here in the sheltered workshop, these people are alive instead of dead. They have a job to do. They're earning money, they're useful.
At the time, they were seen to be best practice. They were a great idea in how to support people with disability to get employment.
Many of the workshops were modelled along industrial lines.
Typically, the people working in the sheltered work services would have arrived sometime between 8:30, 9:15. If you can imagine benches and benches of people all working away busily and lots of noise coming through a radio, deliveries coming in and stuff going back out again. Sheltered workshops were, to all intents and purposes, factories. That's what they were.
Many of the workshops played an important role in the lives of those who may never have had the skills to find outside employment. The nature of the work, frequently determined by commercial contracts, varied enormously from one workshop to another.
The type of work ranges from very interesting horticulture and agriculture activity through to work that has been described to me as numbingly boring, packing materials, assembling Christmas decorations, the kind of work that actually has fled Ireland now and has gone to China.
In the 1970s, the state threw its weight wholeheartedly behind the system as the best means of securing employment in the open market for people with disabilities. By the end of the decade, over 6,000 people were based in commercial sheltered workshops, a third of whom were in state psychiatric hospitals.
Are your products from this workshop going to be commercially available?
Oh yes, we produce in the community workshop, produce hosiery. We trade commercially the same as any other commercial firm.
In 1979, workers received an average allowance of £9 a week on top of their state disability benefit, which they were entitled to whether they worked or not.
Here we can now keep long-stay trainees, if necessary, in the workshop.
The participants were regarded as trainees, that these workshops would eventually provide sufficient experience and skill that they could graduate onto the open labour market. But the opportunities for such graduation never occurred.
Now this is Mark, the farmyard, yeah, where all the farm is. And over this side it is the bungalows where we used to stay, and the industries, yeah, where the workshops used to be.
Paul Alford, who spent 22 years in Peamount Hospital's sheltered workshop, remained in training from the day he entered until the day he left in 2005.
I used to work in the workshops from 9 to 5. It was very hard work. I was packing bottles in the industries, and then I used to put the empty bottles into the cartons, and then they used to be put onto the pallets and stacked so many high. Yes, I thought it was too much and then too hard on the back, yeah, because I used to have a bad back.
In the mid-80s, workers like Paul received up to £20 a week, on top of a state disability benefit of £39 a week. At the time, a junior industrial worker would have earned £141, more than twice Paul's income.
I was doing that for over 20 years. It was brutal pay. I called them sweatshops. You're only working there, you're for pittance.
Peamount's commercial clients included Irish distillers, makers of Jameson and Powers, and Gilbey's, makers of Bailey's Irish Cream. Irish distillers told us they paid full market rate for the work. These contracts clearly paid dividends for Peamount. In the 90s, the income helped finance a major programme of rebuilding and redevelopment to be undertaken without state aid. Peamount told us that
monies earned from the workshops were ploughed back into the service. Individuals were not compelled to attend. The purpose of the workshop was a therapeutic one to enable residents to have something interesting to do, to help occupy their day, and also to gain useful skills. Many service users chose when and how long they attended, and would, on a daily basis, attend other activities also.
When I left in 2005, I got a card from the staff that used to work with me, and then I got €50 in it. Yeah, I think I'm owed an awful lot. Yeah, because I worked there for 22 years.
Many leading Irish companies used the services of sheltered workers, as did semi-states including the ESB, Bord Bia, and indeed RTE. Some businesses regarded it as a means of fulfilling a social obligation.
I remember very clearly where we felt that we were being considered to be a cheap option for businesses. We didn't take the work. And I remember on several occasions actually turning away work because we felt it wasn't going to make any difference to people in their pockets at the end of the week. They did receive an income, although it was abysmal, but to be honest, these workshops didn't make they were loss makers if you really looked at the costs.
At the local workshop, they are trained to work without the heavy responsibility of having to take home a day's pay.
The amount of money generated by these commercial contracts is a matter of some dispute. Rehab was one of the biggest providers of sheltered work in the country, and its workshop in Waterford had a contract with games giant MB Games, now Hasbro. In the 1990s, they received a letter of commendation for delivering 1 million units without flaws. Johnny Barrett spent 25 years there, negotiating business contracts and supervising work.
We would do subcontract work where parts of games were packaged, so it had to be 100%. The people that did the work were not paid because it wasn't seen in the sense of work. It was seen as a learning tool. The money that was got for doing such work, it did not cover the cost of running the minibus that we supplied to collect people. It actually wouldn't cover it. So it was impossible to pay people. We were there to help them develop their own full potential. It wasn't anything to do with work.
Mick Corrigan, who managed the Waterford Centre prior to taking up a senior role at rehab headquarters, takes a very different view on the value of the work.
Some of them would have been doing the same job over and over and over again with very, very little change in the monotony of what they were doing. Literally put items into bags which they then stapled and put into boxes. The work was being done to specification, to standard and on time, and the people doing the work were under pressure to get it done. They ended up with a significant commercial focus.
Rehab told us that the workshops were
a social service provided in good faith to people with disabilities. They were not established for commercial reasons and in fact generated significant losses.
Hasbro told us that from 1999 until 2008, as part of their policy of good corporate citizenship, they paid Rehab €25,000 a year for the contract, and that it was
certainly not an attempt to obtain inexpensive labour. We were asked to engage with this community service by Rehab, and we were happy to lend our support.
These were companies who I'm sure felt that they were doing a good thing and that they were showing good corporate citizenship. The point that was missed in all of this was the very people doing the work were not on any meaningful wage and had no meaningful terms and conditions.
The people clearly were in an employer-employee relationship, and people clearly were not being paid an adequate and proper wage for the work that they were doing.
From the mid-80s onwards, the state began to come under pressure to regulate the workshops and improve pay and conditions for workers.
There was quite clear concern that sheltered workshops were not regulated, that people should come in under employment law, should have a minimum wage, minimum standards, and should have all the protection that employment law afforded to the mainstream. By and large, the advice that went to the Department of Health in the early 90s was generally ignored.
In 1993, then Health Minister Brendan Howlin said he would examine introducing a minimum wage for sheltered workers in the near future. No minimum wage was ever introduced. 4 years later, a government advisory committee stated,
"These workers are vulnerable. Many people are working full weekly hours. The legal status and conditions of people with disabilities involved in these forms of work needs to be addressed urgently."
Once again, nothing was done.
It's not as if the issue hasn't kept popping up in the public domain or been placed in front of government. It has, sporadically, but each time it was suppressed or passed over, and it was hoped that the issue would go away.
The sheltered workshop certainly did operate within a legal limbo, and I suspect that it suited the state. Because if the individuals with disabilities had been found to be employees, there would have been significant rights that those employees were entitled to. I would be satisfied there are good arguments to make that those individuals are employees for the purposes of Irish employment law.
Rehab, the country's biggest service provider, told us
they were not employees, and this was clearly explained to the people themselves and their families. There was therefore no question of an employer-employee relationship. Anyone under the impression that this is the case is misled.
However, Kieran Mulvey, CEO of the Labour Relations Commission, says that the status of these workers is far from clear. He believes this may be because they had no independent representation and therefore no voice.
I was astonished by the dearth of information we had within the Labour Relations Commission. It would appear that we have no real history of cases coming through that system to us. They were almost like ghost workers. The reason perhaps they fell through some of these cracks were the fact that probably they were non-unionised, but secondly, probably those charities that did represent them didn't want to rock the boat. Their parents probably didn't want to rock the boat for fear they wouldn't be given a place in one of these sheltered workshops.
Kieran Mulvey says he's concerned about pay rates in the workshops.
Anecdotal evidence would suggest that the rates of pay may not have been appropriate to the employment. Sometimes the suggestion has been made where they were in training. Well, I would always have considered training to be a defined period. So the idea that anybody would be treated as a trainee for any period longer than 2, 3, 4 years would be, nonsense.
In the early 2000s, the state faced further challenges to the workshop system.
We were convinced that the equality legislation could offer protection to people with disabilities in sheltered workshops, and we were equally convinced that an inquiry would uncover discriminatory behaviour. But very few people actually did bring forward cases, and the few that did, I suppose, gradually dropped out. People were fearful of bringing forward complaints, and it left us in a quandary in that we knew there was quite a significant issue, and yet it was quite clear that the people who were experiencing this issue were too vulnerable and too fearful to bring it forward as a legal case.
On a separate front, a code of practice drawn up by a group including service providers and the health boards highlighted serious concerns about the legal status of workers.
The working group are of the view that there is a considerable level of activity in some existing workshops, within which the determination and recognition of an employment relationship is appropriate.
For service providing organisations, it was a clear challenge to them. Were they an employer or were they, a provider of therapeutic and other types of supports? They couldn't get legal clarity on that, and that's what initiated then the closure of many of them.
Some service providers have withdrawn from the workshops scenario because of the fear that they might be legally liable to pay back wages or holidays, sick pay that hasn't been paid. Unfortunately, some of those who closed down were actually operating very interesting workshops, but they couldn't continue without legal clarification.
Many service providers, including rehab, publicly campaigned for the code's introduction. The code would have meant better pay and given workers a range of entitlements, including sick leave, annual leave, and the right to advocacy. But to this day, it has never been implemented.
The Constitution pledges that all citizens will be treated equally, and people with disabilities are entitled to that equal treatment in law. It's simply the state has not provided either the infrastructure or the means to realise that perspective.
By 2008, less than 3,000 people were still working in commercial sheltered workshops. Special Olympian Rory O'Toole worked for years making furniture in Snipe Industries, a sheltered workshop run by Ability West in Galway. Now he works 3 days a week in Tesco's, receiving the same pay and entitlements as every other member of staff.
Before Rory went into Tesco, he worked in Snipe Industries for 5 days. Now, he was quite happy there and enjoyed it, going in every day. But with the cutbacks and everything, he was getting token money at the time. He just knew that he couldn't get his second pint out of the fiver, whereas with Tesco money, he always had the money.
Thank you.
Okay. Rory is a people's person, so he likes to meet people. When he got the taste of Tesco working with a lot of other lads and girls, he's quite happy there.
Yeah.
Rory's work in Tesco's is part of a supported employment scheme, a successful new work model adopted by many of Ireland's service providers. Rather than a life spent in training set apart from the mainstream, the scheme aims to find the person a real job, support them as they learn on that job, and then help them to maintain it. There are now an estimated 5,000 people currently on such schemes.
And is it important that he's paid properly?
Oh, it is, because if he wants to buy a Celtic top or a Man United top, or a new bicycle, if he wanted to get he'd have the money for that. So it's great. It's like anybody. It's nice to have a few pounds in your pocket.
But are sheltered workshops truly a model of the past? According to HSE figures, 1,486 people still work in commercial sheltered work. That figure is down 50% since 2008. In 1976, Bernard Furlong started as a trainee in Wexford Community Workshop. 37 years later, he's still there, having spent most of that time making pallets for commercial clients. In more recent years, Bernard has been making skipping ropes and clotheslines.
He went into 17, 18 years of age, and the promise was that he would be trained on different things. And he spent 30 years making pallets. The top-up was normally worked out about €1 an hour. And that was kind of more symbolic than anything else, because he was worth something, you know what I mean? This is money that he earned.
Bernard had to pay for all his meals at work from his €40 allowance. Last March, however, his allowance was abruptly stopped. He still has to pay for his meals.
They're being exploited because they're not getting paid anything. I mean, they don't pick up people that are on the dole. You don't get someone, single person that's on the dole and say, come in here and start making skipping ropes or picture frames and stuff. We won't be paying anything. In fact, we'll be charging you for your dinner. There's no one to go in, just because he has a disability. They're operating as a trainee. He's a trainee. How can you trainee someone for 30 years making pallets?
We contacted Wexford Community Workshop, and they told us they
continue to offer employment, training and work experience opportunities to service users in line with best practice. Unfortunately, we are in our 6th year of government cutbacks. We have had to make difficult decisions, including the elimination of attendance allowances to service users in order to protect the volume of day, respite, residential and transport services.
The Muriosa Foundation in Athboy provides sheltered work for 12 women with intellectual disabilities. Many have worked here for 20 years, making high-quality chocolate and baked goods. The workers get paid €60 a week, plus their state benefit. According to the foundation, commercial work is not the focus, but simply a means of supplementing meagre state funding to provide an essential service.
We would love to be in a position to pay people a minimum wage. But it wouldn't be a sustainable proposition. The income that comes in just barely covers the costs. I think it probably is an old-fashioned way of supporting adults with a disability. I don't think we'd be doing it again in the morning. But this, I am absolutely sure that this has added enormous value to the lives of the 12 people who work here. There's enormous variation within what sails under the flag of sheltered workshop. I think this is probably quite a good example of a sheltered workshop, but I've certainly seen in the 1980s and 90s very monotonous, soul-destroying contract work that really wouldn't have been very helpful.
The HSE says it recognises the need to move away from sheltered work. Yet for the 1,500 people still in sheltered work, the regulation and changes promised as far back as the early 90s have never been introduced. Kieran Mulvey says it's time to address this issue now and compensate many thousands of disabled workers who lost out financially because they were not salaried workers.
I've always operated with the cardinal principle I use that justice delayed is justice denied. We've had to address this issue in the Magdalen laundries. If there is an injustice, it should be rectified. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that their employment records could be revisited. Are these people getting the appropriate payments under pension law? These were the most vulnerable people in employment at the time, and it's not beyond the bounds of ingenuity for us to address it now.
I think any person, be they disabled or not, who is not fully remunerated with consent and transparency for the labour that they expend, that is exploitation. This is an unregulated sphere. It must be regulated now.
I have no right to appeal even the decision that Trevor Jacob makes in there. I can't appeal it to anybody. I can only highlight what I found here. That these people are being used as slaves, and slave labour means that you get someone, you work them and don't pay them, and then you put them on, you use them as collection plates then on a Sunday morning when people are going to mass, and this is what this money is being used to fundraise, and they're getting none of this money. What we need in Enniscorthy and other places is group representation. What group representation would do is that the parents and guardians of these people would actually have some say in the running and the finances and the approach that they're using with this money that they're getting over $1 million a year. Their account should be available to anyone. The last government, the Labour government, in their manifesto said that transparency was one of the things they wanted. Where's the transparency when you tell someone our accounts are on the CEO website, and if you want to pay €250 to access them, you can get it? The next thing I was also told in there, when I went looking for aid, I was told that there wasn't a banking service. We're not a banking service. And all I can say to them is, I'm not a banking service either. I have to make a living. I have a wife and family to support, and I have to keep 2 houses now instead of 1. They're wanting people like Bernard with disabilities to go out and live in the community. And this is what's done with them. I'm not blaming Kilcannon for everything, but I'm blaming politicians, the high approach. We have Paul Keogh, Brendan Howland, John Brown, everyone here with letters saying, live with it. That's their answer to you. Live with your lot. The next thing I'm saying is, I wanted a new CEO. That man is there long enough. He's not doing anything for people only. He's not doing anything for the people that's in there. He should be sacked. I believe his former employment was a farm manager. Well, farm managers are regulated, farms are regulated, and cruelty to animals is a crime. If he had done this to an animal in Enniscorthy, what he done to my brother, he'd be locked up again now. If they're saying that they have no money in their accounts and they had to cut this €40 a week of an allowance, which is less than €1 an hour he was getting for getting out of bed here at 7 o'clock in the morning, going in there and working, making pallets with no entitlements whatsoever as regards to pensions or anything else. If they're saying they have no money, why don't they put their accounts up on their website? What I need here is, I need a different approach to the way this place is run, and everyone else will agree with me. That what you need is a different CEO. You need a rotating CEO, which is not uncommon in companies, where the CEO that's not in position at the moment can go out to the like of families and say, listen, what do you want? What's the future? What do you think is going to happen to your son or your daughter or your brother or sister? And go to them and say, what's the future? Will they suddenly arrive on our doorstep or on someone else's doorstep when we're dead and gone?
So, John, what you were saying in there, not only Bernard is not getting paid.
No, everybody in there is not getting paid. They withdrew it. They have it here that they're actually withdrawing it.
So he's been asked to work for nothing?
He's been asked to work for nothing, and it's been put down as training. But there's restaurants being run, there's being run, restaurants making picture frames, there's a car wash in there, and you pity people in there standing on the car wash.
But isn't he lucky that he's getting his meals for free?
He's not getting meals for free, he has to pay for his meals. His meals are stopped out of his wages every week, every month, and it's costing more, and they base their canteen prices.
What you're saying to me is that he's not getting paid, he's doing manual labour, and he's asked to pay for his meals.
Everyone is doing manual labour, and everyone's been asked to pay for their meals. I'm not just an individual case, and I do not want this to be put down as John and Bernard Furlong. I want to be this to be as everybody that's using that service.
John, sum it up for me. Is it slavery?
You can see for yourself what it is. If I employ someone down in my garage and don't pay him, it'll be called slavery. I'd have the government in on me. You have to pay people for what they do. We have a board of directors in there that put their names forward every year and get re-elected. When I approached them over the issues that I had in CW and Enniscorthy, I was told no comment. Trevor is dealing with them.
John, when you say CW,
or Enniscorthy Workshop, I'm talking about the workshop.
Community workshop.
The community workshop in Belfield. Yes. And we're talking about board of directors that her names are there. And I was told that no matter which one of them I rang, I would be told no comment. Trevor's dealing with that.
And has it been dealt with?
Not been dealt with. I have not been approached by anybody.
So just the question then for you, is Bernard getting paid now?
Bernard's not getting paid anything. Bernard's actually paying to go in there.
And so Bernard is on social welfare?
He's on a disability allowance of €188 a week, and he pays €30, approximately €30 a week for his meals. He has to pay €10 a week for a bus to go in.
And how does he live?
He lives because I had to subsidise him. I had to build this here out of my own pocket.
So our government today is using Bernard Furlong and many other people like him as, what should I say?
The Troika made me do it. That's what they're saying, the Troika made me do it. The Troika didn't cut the funding in CW in Enniscorthy.
And what's the average salary, I wonder, of the CEO in there?
I have no idea, but you could look at Angela Cairns, what she was getting, and maybe Trevor Jacob will say what he was getting. And Angela Cairns is the rehab.
And they would cut
They gave themselves,
like him.
they gave themselves, according to their accounts, they gave themselves a 10% increase in wages. The office and administration went up by 10% while they were cutting him at the same time. They cut his wages at the same time.
And okay, we could say that, Bernard, we're going to take you out of there. What would these people say then?
Take him with you. I've been told that he doesn't have to go in there. But when you institutionalise somebody, they go in. He thinks that's his job. He thinks that's where he is. And I've no complaints what he has at the moment. My complaints is with the CEO and the way he's just getting out of the bed here at 7 o'clock every morning, getting on a bus and going in and working and getting nothing for it.
So really he's, as you say, computerised, institutionalised.
He's institutionalised. And there's no other option for him. He either stays here or goes in there. There's no other option. And there's no choice with anybody. Anyone that sends their siblings in there, anyone belonging to him, there's no choice. It's whatever Trevor says it goes. And the HSE, I don't think cares. They're supposed to be regulated by the HSE. Nobody from the HSE come near me. I've contacted Inclusion Ireland, or Inclusion Ireland seem to be a shoulder to cry on if you want it.
So John, summarise.
And Paddy Conley's there on that video as well.
Summarise.
And summarise is it's a good service, but it has to be reformed. It has to have transparency. What happened to my brother over the last 30 years cannot happen to anyone else, and that's why I'm doing it.
And John, they must get paid.
They must get some reward. If there's only so much money put by, so as if they wanted to go independent living, you're talking about €40 a week to subsidise him here. It's not an awful lot of money to subsidise someone today.
Well, it's a human right.
There's people getting €40 a week in expenses for meals every day.
It's a human right thing.
It's a human right thing, and you see people there on that, Kieran Mulvey, people on that are talking about. And there's people now looking to go to the European elections, and they want to be MEPs. Take this over with you to Europe. There's snails above in Mayo, and the bogs in Mayo have more rights than my brother has, and people in Enniscorthy has. They're following Luke Ming Flanagan around the place, wondering what he's doing up there, and they're worrying about snails in the bogs in Mayo. Everything is regulated. Leo Varadkar come out, and he said with the speed cameras and with speed signs, I can appeal a speed sign outside my gate, and I can't appeal a decision that's been made in Enniscorthy workshop.
John, what would you say to the politicians now that are running for office?
Ones that are running for office, do something about it. Approach these people, and if you get elected, do something about it. And the ones that don't get elected, do something about it.
John, and finally, for me, to the present regime that's in Dublin, the powers that be that's in Dublin, in Dáil, what would you say to them?
What I would say
to your local politicians.
To my local politician is very simple. A Labour government, we have a Labour government, Labour politicians gets into government on a working man's ticket, but they don't work for the working man when they get in. That's what I have to say to them. Brendan Howland loves to get in on a working man's ticket, but they don't work for him when they're in.
And to your local Fine Gael politician, would you say?
The Fine Gael politician is Paul Keogh, the man that I approached here, and he's a great man to delegate. He told me here in a letter where he was going to send off Bernard's case off to Francis Fitzgerald. That letter is dated 2012, and I still haven't got contacted by Francis Fitzgerald. He's a great man to delegate work to somebody else. Maybe that's why he's government chief whip, because he's no good for anything else.